over to Devashri.
Thank you, Brahmer. So, the first part of the talk, we will be talking about, the forecasting that we did even before the lockdown was announced in India. And then we have done some post-lockdown analysis forecasting. We have talked about, we'll talk about strategic vision about how to come out of a lockdown. Next slide, please. And so, as Brahmer mentioned, when we started this work, we had about, a few hundred cases, a handful of deaths. And the first Medium article came out on March 20th. And, at that time, we have seen how the disease has, is progressing in every other country, and it took everyone by surprise. We were used to a linear way of life, and suddenly we were exposed to exponential growth. And we were particularly worried about India, although at that point of time, we only have, a few hundred cases. And that's because, we have, several vulnerable subpopulations in India. We have a large number of Indians belonging to risk categories that have been identified for COVID-19. For example, hypertensive people or people suffering from cardiovascular diseases, diabetes. There is a large number of uninsured people, old people. And then on top of that, in India, we have a very fragile healthcare infrastructure. There's less than one bed per 1,000 people, at most 60,000 ICU beds with one ventilator per 2 ICU beds. So when we were seeing that India has, for example, younger population, or even some other protective risk factors that we are going to talk about later. So in our first Medium article, we came up with this pre-lockdown forecast. So at that point of time, we had no non-pharmaceutical intervention. And we were comparing what the growth has been like for India with US and Italy. So the red bar plots for India, green for US, and blue for Italy. And the dotted vertical line, that's where the forecast starts. And so I would also like to point out the dotted horizontal line that gives the the upper credible limit for the forecast that we made for India. So as of March 16, we found that on May 15 we were expecting close to 60,000 cases, whereas the upper credible limit said that it could go up to 900,000 individuals. So, and then when we published this in our Medium article, there was a huge media coverage. The media was attracted by these numbers, but within 2 days, we had to recalculate all these estimates. So the 60,000 point estimate that we had for May 15, that changed to 97,000 within 2 days. And the upper credible limit, which was quantifying the uncertainty in our estimates, went from 900,000 to 1.3 million. And so because the projections were changing daily, we thought of coming out with this app that could update the projections every day. And so the historic lockdown was then announced on March 24th night with at most 3 hours notice. So we welcome this decision because it's best to do the lockdown in the early part of the epidemic. That's when you get the maximum advantage from an epidemiologic standpoint. But there's also massive collateral damage. For example, we found because the lockdown was announced with 3 hours notice, and all modes of transport and communication were halted, the migrant workers were walking back hundreds of miles to their homelands. And then, there was social isolation. So people were showing solidarity by lighting candles and diyas. And so, these collateral damage, they are not all quantifiable. Here we were only going to talk about the epidemiologic side of the lockdown. And as you can see, this attracted a huge amount of media attention, and we are thankful to all the journalists who covered our work. Next slide. And so what the lockdown does, it simply buys us time. It helps us use data to optimally deploy resources so that we can support the vulnerable. We can ramp up testing, disease surveillance, contact tracing. And it requires a huge amount of public and government partnership. And we require long-term strategies, in a continuous fashion, and instead of discrete short-term tactics. So as one of Bhramar's friend pointed out, this coronavirus in India is like a tidal wave. We had a picket fence, and now we need to build watchtowers, dams, escape boats, and that's what the lockdown helps us. It buys us time to do that. We cannot escape the wave, but at least we can prepare ourselves to manage that wave. So next slide, please. So when we worked on this, projection for India, the questions that came to our mind were, how would the number of cases change, after lockdown, if there was a prolonged lockdown? And then would we be, seeing any decline in fatalities? And what would a successful lockdown look like? And in this respect, we wanted to compare with other countries that had successful lockdowns, and also discuss strategies for coming back to normal. And next slide, please. So we will now look at other countries, other places that have successfully implemented, lockdowns. For example, we first look at Hubei, China. So why do we look at other countries? Because we cannot perform any randomized experiment to see or to compare the effects of different non-pharmaceutical interventions such as lockdown. But then there is a natural experiment that is going on around in the world, and that's why we're trying to look at different countries. In Hubei, China, we see that lockdown was in place on January 23, and within about 2-3 weeks, we see a sharp decline in the number of cases, and then with a lag, a decline in the number of deaths as well. Then we look at South Korea. There we see that the number of cases suddenly start rising around mid-February. But around that time, South Korea took extensive testing and contact tracing program and emphasized voluntary, social distancing and self-quarantine. Without any lockdown, again, we see that within 2-3 weeks, there is a sharp decline in the number of cases and fatalities. Then we come to Italy. There, the lockdown was implemented on March 9. As we can see, it was already well into the epidemic. And so it took a much longer time for Italy to see any kind of decline. Here we need to keep in mind a characteristic of the coronavirus. It's that, the incubation period of the virus is about 5 to 7 days. And 97% of the symptomatic people show symptoms in 12 to 14 days. And so we see after the lockdown happened in March 9, it took 3 to 4 weeks to see a decline. Now we come to India. Our lockdown was implemented on March 25 when we only had 500 cases. However, after a prolonged lockdown, even until, May 31, which was continued in like 4 phases, we see a continuous increase in the number of cases, in the number of fatalities. Right now, we are in the second unlock phase of this, of India. However, we do not see, the decline in the number of cases or fatalities as we had seen for other countries. So we are going to discuss why is it different for India? Is this the only metric that we should be looking at to judge whether the lockdown was successful in India or not? But before that, we will be looking at forecasting models. Here we have listed a few forecasting models that are very India specific, and they can be classified into 2 groups. One being the exponential Poisson regression kind of model, and the other compartmental models like the SIR model, where differential equations determine the flow of individuals from one compartment to another. And now I'll hand it over to Rupam to explain the model that we have used.